Everyone here surely knows the name Eric Liddell. Perhaps you saw the movie. I think it came out in the 1980s, The Chariots of Fire. Liddell was a man who came under immense pressure to conform in that setting. Remember the story, those of you who know it, in the 1924 Paris Olympic Games. He came under immense pressure to conform to what was happening there. But Liddell would not buckle. He purposed in his heart not to defile himself. We can put it, Eric Liddell stood for his God. His heart conviction was that if his Olympic race fell on the Lord's Day, that he would simply not run. He knew he could not run on the Lord's Day and maintain a clear conscience about that day holy for the Lord. Despite all the months' preparation leading up to the Paris Olympics, despite the potential fame that lay before him as someone who had already built a great reputation on the track, the pressure to toe must have been enormous on him. And yet the amazing thing is that if it was that he would have buckled under the pressure and even won that particular race, we probably wouldn't know his name today. He'd be forgotten to history. Or we could look up the record books and find his name, but it just looked like every other name on the list of the 1924 Olympics. We, many of us at least, remember him as someone who stood for God. Well, as we continue the series on the character of Daniel today, we see Daniel as one who, though he came under immense pressure to conform to the ways of the world, he nevertheless, like Liddell, stood for God. You know, I think we see the same thing with Daniel as we do Liddell. There were possibly dozens of other young guys from Judah who were also with Daniel and his mates who got deported or taken into slavery, if you like, ended up in Babylon. And yet, lots of them, perhaps dozens of those other Israelite teenagers, buckled under the pressure. Their names, we do not know. It's Daniel's name that we know. It's Daniel that the scriptures record. Yes, his three friends, but particularly Daniel stands out. From our study last week, Daniel was a young man, merely a teenager. And yet, even as a young person, by God's grace, he stood for God. I wonder, those of you who are professed Christians, how do you go stand for God? When those pressures are mounting at work, or perhaps when those pressures are mounting at home, when those pressures are mounting in the context of school or with other friends, the pressure to compromise and give in, the pressure to put aside the Lord's will and way, do you stand for Him? Well, this morning, friends, as we come back to chapter 1 here in Daniel, our focus is now on the second half of this chapter. What I've entitled, simply Standing for God. Last Lord saw how King Nebuchadnezzar had overrun Judah. Remember, in the year 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar had captured the cream of young men there in Judah. And among those captives, as we've just reminded you about before, is Daniel, the teenager, amongst that group. Daniel had been taken from the relatively safe and insulated environment there in Judah, in the theocratic government, taken away from that and thrust into pagan Babylonian society. As we said last week, he's taken into a dark world where Daniel shines for God. We saw how Nebuchadnezzar endeavoured to completely indoctrinate these young men in Babylonian ways. Nebuchadnezzar wanted his young recruits to dress like Babylonians, to think like Babylonians, to speak like Babylonians, to behave like Babylonians, to be named like Babylonians, and as we'll see this morning, he even wanted them to eat like Babylonians. And yet it was at this very point that Daniel draws the line. Daniel would not conform when it came to. In this issue of diet, Daniel resolutely stood for God. And there are three things I want us to think about as we work our way through the bulk of this passage this morning. And the first of those is this: the motive to stand. The question, the motive to stand. Why did Daniel draw the line on this issue? What reason is mentioned in the passage itself for Daniel refusing to conform to all this pressure that he was under? Well, if you look with me, in your own copy of the Scriptures, in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8, I think we find something of an answer to that question. Why did Daniel draw the line with this issue? What's the reason mentioned for Daniel refusing to conform? Daniel 1 verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Daniel recognized that this new diet that was placed before him and all of his other fellow young people, that this diet created a problem, not with his stomach, it created a problem with his conscience. Verse 8 says there, he would not defile himself with the king's delicacies. That word defile in the Hebrew has the idea to corrupt the purity of something, or to pollute, or to contaminate it. Can you imagine the outcry if in the process currently of the state government here in Queensland connecting up the new water grid, incorporating recycled water into the main drinking water supply, that in the process of that the contractors that the government had employed to do this massive task, that the contractors made a dreadful mistake. Imagine the outcry if those contractors connected up the wrong pipes from the sewage treatment plant. So instead of connecting up treated recycled water, they actually had the pure, if you can call it that, sewage water pumped directly into the main water supply, the drinking water. Can you imagine the outcry? Now, many of you feel safe because you have tank. Good for you. But when you get invited to my place, and I go to the cupboard and pull out a lovely clear glass, and turn the tap on and run that water, and pour it into the glass, and very kindly offer to you a glass of water on a hot sun. Would you drink that water? The answer's obvious. I wouldn't. Why? Because the water that came out of my tap would be contaminated. It is being polluted. It is being held. Daniel had a similar concern. He knew that if he ate and drank at the king's table, he would be contaminated. The language is, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not contaminate, he would not pollute himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with his wine. Daniel was a young man who was so determined to maintain his purity, even in seemingly small things. Here he is. Remember where he is. He's far from home. He's a young man. But he cared more for pleasing God than pleasing men. He's not willing to pollute his reputation, as we thought of that last week. He's shining for God. He knows he has that reputation, no doubt. He doesn't want to pollute that reputation. He doesn't want to corrupt his witness. He doesn't want to contemn character as a godly young man with compromise. Even far away from home, he maintained a sensitivity to his God, even over what he ate. Now, why did Daniel dig his toes in over a change in diet? Doesn't it seem a little extreme? I mean, how could eating the king's delicacies, the king's delicious food, how could that be a problem? How could that be contaminating? Well, perhaps one answer that we can give to that is that as a faithful Israelite seeking to live in according to the law of Moses, he knew that what the king served up on his table would violate the dietary requirements of the Old Covenant. And perhaps what he had as a lad, or all those early formative years back at home there in Judah, he had been clearly taught by his parents, early days, the list of foods that Israelites were allowed to eat according to God, as well as the things that the Israelites were not to partake of. Now, I don't know, but let's just think along these lines. Maybe Daniel realized that the king always had bacon for breakfast. Bacon. Maybe Daniel had come to understand that at every lunch the chefs would bring out from the kitchen there in the palace, they'd bring out ham sandwiches. And then every evening for tea, they would serve out before the king roast pork. And for Daniel to eat pig would violate God's dietary law as an Israelite. Daniel would not defile himself by partaking of such a diet, for he knew that it was forbidden by God. So verse 8 tells us Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not contaminate himself with that food and drink. I want to suggest to you, that's possibly an answer, but I want to suggest to you perhaps the more major issue, the bigger problem, that Daniel partaking of the king's delicacies was related to idolatry. He saw that for him to partake of these things would send the message that he was actually in league with idolaters. This was ultimately a heart issue. Isn't that what verse 8 says? Daniel purposed in his heart not to defile himself. You see, in the end, this had nothing to do with calories. This issue of whether he would eat or not eat had nothing to do with cholesterol. That wasn't the issue in his mind. Daniel is not here for us a vegetarian diet. He's not one of those people that, counts calories. That's not what this is about. This is not about Daniel having a diet that he would get to tick from the Heart Foundation. This is not about that. This is about it's about the heart. But it's about him having a right heart before God. His concern was not with the Heart Foundation's tick. His concern was with the tick he would get from God. You see, every meal in the royal palace was offered to idols prior to being served to be eaten. Apparently the Babylonian priests, which of course were priests of false gods, presided over those meals. Thanks were given to the gods who they regarded as providing that food. So the meal began with an act of pagan worship. The king's delicacies were eaten in honor of false gods. This therefore meant that to partake of the king's delicacies, to partake of his table, would lead to him practically denying that there is one true God. Daniel would not content himself with the sin of idolatry. He wanted to remain pure and loyal to his God. He purposed in his heart not to defile himself. The motive to stand. But secondly, think with me now about the might to conform. I want to feel the passage, if you understand what I'm trying to say. To try and imagine and feel the immense pressure that Daniel was under at this point to conform. I want us to feel the pressure that he was under as a young man to compromise, to simply eat up what's put in front of him. No doubt Eric Liddell was under great pressure to conform, to run on that Lord's Day. But Daniel knew far greater pressure. I believe we see the passage. You think about the pressure here, it's in the passage. Think firstly about who it was, who had appointed the diet for Daniel. Who had appointed the diet according to the passage? Well, the answer's obvious. King Nebuchadnezzar had appointed the diet. And who is... You say, well, why are you asking such obvious questions? He's the king. Yes, he is the king of Babylon. But he's the king of Babylon. And it's 605 BC. And at that point in world history, Babylon is the superpower of the world. Nebuchadnezzar is the king of the superpower of the world. What does that mean? It means that Nebuchadnezzar was the most powerful man on the face of the earth at that point in time. Verse 5 says, and the king, the most powerful man in the world of the earth at that point in time, appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank. The king, the strongest and greatest, most powerful king in the then world, appointed it. And here is Daniel standing all alone for the world's most powerful man. Now, do you feel a little bit of pressure? Put yourself in his sandals. That was pressure to conform. Pressure to do what the most powerful man had said you should do. But now also think of the future for Daniel. He's a young guy. Future's all before him. Just beginning his training as a career. He realizes if down here that he might have his head removed from his shoulders. Nebuchadnezzar, and for that matter, many of the other Babylonian rulers, had a reputation for not being slow to use the execution sword. Pressure. You feeling the pressure? It's beginning to mount. It appears from the passage that everyone else who was with him was going along with what the king was saying. When we look at verse 6, where it mentions 4 names, Daniel of course being one of them, notice what it also says at the start of the verse. It says, now from among those of the sons of Judah were. So there are others more than just these 4, more than Daniel. The majority of those other young guys were simply going along and falling into line with what was happening there in the palace. Try and put yourself in the situation of the peer group pressure. Come on, Daniel. Aren't you being a little big in the mud? Don't you think you're taking your religion a little bit too far this time? And why are you being so awkward about just a bit of food, Daniel? Stop rocking the boat, Dan. You worried about Mummy and Daddy? Mum and Dad will move there 800 kilometres away. Stop being such a sissy. You could lose your head over this, Daniel. And let's just stop and think, Daniel, for a moment. What good way you be to the kingdom of God if you're dead? You just eat the food and pursue your career. You could make your way right to the top and influence and think what good you could do for Israel then. Come on, just join with us and have the food. No doubt the peer group pressure was really strong. But I want us to go even to a different level here and almost say above and beyond all of that, there's something that was happening inside Daniel, I want to suggest, that was really, really strong. On a very everyday level. You think of how appealing spread must have looked to Daniel. How old is Daniel? Well, as we made a suggestion last week, he's around 14 years old. What do we know about teenage lads? We know that they love them, don't we? They delight in a banquet. They delight when it's a party. They delight to dig in and to eat that food. There's a few teenage lads here this morning. We did a little survey. If we just simply went straight to mum, straight to dad, and just asked them the question, straight to your brothers and sisters, ask them, does he eat much? We all know what the answer is. Many of us have been there. Teenage lads has a reputation for loving food. You imagine then how strong, how inviting that food must have looked. How strong this temptation must have young teenage Daniel. The might to conform. And remember what was laid out before him. This is the king's table. He had all the wealth in the world that was available to him then. He could sink lots of that money into what he ate. Imagine the quantity of the food that was available. Imagine the variety that these lads had never seen in Judah. Imagine the quality of the food. Let your imagination go wild. Smell right now the fragrance from that kitchen that would waft out. Those chefs were working hard. Oh, it's beautiful. Taste the exotic flavours of that Middle Eastern Babylonian food. It's delicious. It's mouth-watering. And what's the alternative diet? Verse 12. Please, test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. There's the alternative, guys. Vegetables and water. A diet of perpetual salad. Does that sound inviting? Lettuce and parsley for the next 10 days and then probably for 3 years. You're saying you're kidding me, aren't you? That's not inviting to me. Well, try and imagine the two tables before these young guys. Here's one table, and on it's just lettuce and celery and parsley and shallots and all the green stuff. And over here is this massive table. Sweet food, rich food, all the meats, all the smells, all the delights. It's wafting towards your nostril. And here's your choice. And if you're a lad here, you'd say, well, that's not even in the category of choice. That's not even a decision. I'll just go one way straight away. I haven't even got to think about that one. That was real pressure. Real pressure. So we put all these things together. Surely the pressure was immense for Daniel to conform. That's why I've said the might to conform. The powerful influence that's coming to bear on the mind and the heart. Will I give in? Will I stand? What will I do? I should conform. I want to conform. I shouldn't conform. Here's the pressure. The might to conform. Then thirdly, finally, the manner of standing. And again, verse 8, I think verse 8, it's probably obvious, 8's the key that unlocks in many ways the second half of the chapter, and in some ways the whole book, when it comes to the character. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. All the pull of the flesh to go that way where that table was. That despite the natural human appetites that are happening inside this teenager, despite the desire to please the peers who stand around him, despite the edict from the most powerful man in the world, despite his future career that lay him, despite his own teenage taste buds that are watering inside of his mouth, Daniel, it says, purposed in his heart. He had a clear head. He had a burning heart. And he had a resolute will. Despite the immense pressure, Daniel stood for his God in that pagan society and in that pagan university, in the cafeteria, in the palace. These were the early days, remember, for Daniel. This is the early days in Babylon. And it's in the early days that Daniel stood for God. And friends, we should just park there. What a lesson. He stood for God in the early days. As a young man, think, well, I'll do it later in life. He stood for God as a teenager. His early decision in that situation there in Babylon, I would suggest, gave him then a godly reputation that lasted for a lifetime. Him standing early then enabled him, and it gave him, as it were, it made it easier, as it were, for him to stand and to stand and to stand right until 70 years later. The end of chapter 1 says, thus Daniel continued until the first reign of King Cyrus. He was able to stand 70 years, as we made mention last week of verse 21. It's a reference to 70 years. He was able to stand for 70 years. How? Because he learned to stood early in his life for God. Young people, in the words of the stand up for Jesus. And stand early. Take the very first opportunity to stand for God. Don't wait for a more convenient or what you might think might be an easier occasion. It may never come. It will surely never come. Stand for Jesus at work. Stand for Him at school. At the university, stand for God. In that new classroom that some of you will go into in a few weeks at school. Day number 1, stand for Jesus. On the first day of that new job, stand for Jesus. You see, to stand early will make it so much easier for the next time. And it will potentially place you in good place that you, by God's grace, will still be standing in 70 years' time. Stand early at the start. You set yourself a rough road to try and stand in the future. What a challenge this passage is, not just to young people, but to all of us. One little compromise can very easily lead to another, and then another, and then another. And it seems that Daniel knew that. How it is essential that we maintain a clear conscience before God if we're going to be able to stand for Him. It's essential that we maintain a right heart before our God. It's essential that we may seek to please God and foremostly rather than other people, whoever they are. Daniel had a very big temptation placed before him. The pressure for him to conform was immense. And some of you, no doubt, have great temptations before you. Satan knows exactly what your weakness is. So that's where he aims. He doesn't play fair. He goes for the weak spot. The pressure to fall into line. Just to please your friends. You don't want the guy of you at school or at work. The pressure to fall back into the old ways, into the bad habits of the past. The pressure to associate with those who we know, as we read before in 1 Corinthians 15, we shouldn't associate with because it will corrupt us. The pressure. Some of you, that's almost overpowering those temptations. Satan wants you to crumble. That's his plan. Daniel chapter 1 verse 8. But Daniel, in his heart, the Hebrew there literally is Daniel set upon his heart. Daniel was constrained under a sense of duty. You see, this was not a matter of doing what just felt good, which is what we hear about today, and of just falling into line with everyone else around him. This was a matter of doing what was right before God. This was a matter of acting with a right heart. You see, ultimately, the only tick that Daniel was after was not his own tick. It was not the tick of his friends. It wasn't the Heart Foundation. It was God's tick. as a teenager, as a young person, he wasn't acting on impulse. His brain was engaged. This was an intelligent resolve. But it was far more than just an intellectual decision. Verse 8 tells us this was about the heart. This was a heart conviction. Clear head, but a burning heart and a resolute will. Or that we could have all three of them engaged at the same time as Daniel did. Clear head, burning heart, resolute will to walk in the ways of God. The manner of standing as presented to us in this passage. This was a young man operating with conviction. This is no time to negotiate with Nebuchadnezzar. This was no time to compromise, to flirt with compromise. We don't read about Daniel entering into some negotiations or putting forward some pragmatic policy that might be to the politician Nebuchadnezzar. This wasn't about him surviving that day through some means of compromise or so on. Daniel was doing his duty faithfully before God, and he did it from the heart. It's a heart issue, a purpose in his heart, not himself. There's conviction. But another thing that comes out in this passage from verses 9 to 13 as the story unfolds is that Daniel acted consistently in this situation. How often has it been for you? You know, I'm going to stand on this one, and you stand on the right start, and then you fall. Well, you stand on it, and then you fall, and you fall. Not Daniel. Despite the pressure, consistently he stood. According to the end of verse 8, it says, he requested of the chief of eunuchs if he could be excused from the table. He placed his request, chief of eunuchs, if he could be excused from that. But when the chief of eunuchs effectively said to Daniel in verse 9, no, you're not excused from the table. Daniel was not fazed by that no. Daniel's not put off. Daniel's not intimidated. Daniel did not give up, no quitter when things got a little tougher. Verse 11 tells us as the story there unfolds that Daniel then goes to someone else. Daniel tries the steward. How some of us perhaps need a good dose of this spirit of determination, not being a quitter, staying the course of conviction consistently. Daniel did not give up. Though he's only a youth, he was clearly a young man who was filled with the Spirit of God. For it was by God's grace, as we said last week, and it's in God's strength alone that he resisted the strong temptation that was before him, and that he could consistently stand for God. Conviction, consistency. The last thing I want to highlight from this passage is that Daniel stood for God in a way that was... Is it not true that often when we might feel strongly about something, we plant the flag, we will not budge, that we can do that in an ungracious way? Our passions can be carelessly and rudely expressed. Our zeal and our depth of conviction can be communicated in such a way that it can cause an offence to others and ultimately can dishonour God. But not Daniel. Look back at verse 8. We're now at the end of verse 8. And listen to the worded. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Daniel went about this in a tactful and courteous way. He sought permission. He requested. He didn't do it with disrespect and rudeness. As much as was possible, he seems to have sought to avoid offence. As much as was possible, he sought to live peaceably with all men. He spoke with humility, and he used good manners. Verse 12. His words to the steward are, please Test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Please. He's been taught well by Mum and Dad. Please. And notice what he calls himself. I'm but a servant. He knew his place. He wasn't arrogantly demanding to be treated like a king. He doesn't think he's some great upstart there about to dominate the world. A servant. I'm just a servant with these others. And yet though he was courteous, he was still candid. His politeness wasn't a cloak for compromise. He honestly and boldly stated his concerns and stood his ground for God, but the point I make is he did it graciously. He did it courteously. In other words, Daniel held on to his religious convictions, his heart convictions, and he did it in a spirit of humility and grace. I wonder if that's a lesson that some of us have need to learn from Daniel. I'd be one of the first to say that it seems that there are fewer and fewer today who seem to know what it is to have deep and firm, spirit-wrought, biblical heart convictions. But if we are to hold our biblical convictions in a way that pleases God, then I would suggest Daniel stands out to us as a wonderful example to imitate at this point. There must be conviction. There needs to be consistency. But there must also be a courteous spirit. Why? Well, we are God's ambassadors. Daniel was in Babylon representing Jehovah. How are they going to know about Jehovah? Well, the best way they know about Jehovah is watch Daniel and listen to him. As Christians, we're put on this earth, now that we're saved, we are the representatives of the most powerful king who ever there is, King Jesus. We're his representatives. Satan's plan was that Daniel would crumble under the pressure. Satan's plan was to assist Nebuchadnezzar so that everything about the Lord would disappear. His name, his law, his covenant, his witness, his people, all would be gone. And probably at this point Satan thinks he's got his plan happening and he's going to win. The impression that if Daniel didn't stand for God on this day, then there would be no hope for the people of God. But Satan's plan, his plans are not sovereign and they're not certain. God's plans are. They're sovereign and they're certain. God had ordained that Daniel, though in himself weak, but by God's grace he would stand for God not only on that day, but as verse 21 says, he would continue right to King Cyrus. And surely God is to be glorified. As we look at this story, we're not here to glorify a man, we're not here to glorify Daniel, we're here to glorify God and see God, what God can do in an ordinary teenager's life. There's a sense in which this whole scene, in some sense, to Jesus Christ. I want to suggest to you as we close and come to the Lord's table, that Daniel's story, the story that we've looked at this morning, in some ways, illustrates Christ's story. I want you to think about it. Daniel's taken from his home. He leaves his home. And he goes into a kingdom of this world. Think of Jesus. Jesus is taken from his Father's home in glory. And he was placed by God into the kingdom of this world. From Jesus' earliest days, right from his youth, Jesus purposed in his heart not to defile himself, and we know that he remained spotless all his days. Now it's very interesting, as one of you shared with me last night, I believe it's correct, that in the book of Daniel, there's no record of any blemish in his life at all, no record of his sin.
Isn't that interesting? That's not the case with the record of Moses' life and Abraham and Jacob, and on we could go, Noah, da-da-da-da. But is it Daniel?
It's not saying that Daniel didn't sin. Yes, he was. But in that sense, you see, it's an illustration. It points us towards Christ because it's Jesus alone who was spotless all his days. Our human minds can't fully comprehend the number and the strength of temptations that Jesus had to face on this earth. But the Scriptures do teach us that he was tempted in points as we are, yet without sin. We know, don't we, that Satan came in the wilderness to Jesus, and Satan appealed to Jesus' human appetites. You remember? It's been 40 days and Jesus hasn't eaten anything. So he's a human. He has a human body. He's also divine. You don't eat for 40 days, what are you going to be? Absolutely starving. Jesus was hungry. The Bible tells us that. And what does Satan do? He goes for the weakness, or the perceived weakness on his part. Satan comes and he places a very strong temptation before Jesus, and it's over food as well. One of those temptations is, command this stone to become bread. Satan's plan was that Jesus, at this point before his ministry in a sense began, that Jesus would crumble. But Jesus purposed in his heart not to defile himself. Certainly in the days and hours leading up to his crucifixion, Jesus had strong temptations placed before him. But Jesus, in all of that, would not be distracted from his Father's will. It's Luke who says that Jesus faced with steadfastness toward Jerusalem. He would not be distracted. He would not be tempted to go either way from that path. Jesus acted with deep heart conviction, consistently resisting temptations for him to turn from the path of obedience. That's all, and that's the last 3 years as well, but perhaps it's no more clearly presented to us. The clarity of this issue was when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, knowing what's coming the very next day, knowing about all the physical agony that he would have to endure, knowing the spiritual trauma that he would have to undergo. Jesus, in his sinless humanity, very naturally asked the question of his Father, if it is possible, let this cup of your wrath pass from me. But even then, he purposed in his heart to defile himself, and he said, not my will, but yours be done. But Jesus knew that he had to lay down his life for the sheep. He had to come to be the propitiation for our sins. His own lifeblood must be shed if he was to save his people from their sins. He must endure the wrath of God. When sinful humanity desperately needed it the most, Jesus stood for God's purpose. And he drank every bitter drop of the cup of his Father's wrath. You know, even when we analyse the manner of Jesus' conduct in those final hours, do we not see godly courtesy? There, standing alone before the most powerful political man in Pontius Pilate, there, Jesus surrounded by all those compromisers. There, Jesus surrounded by weak ones who had crumbled under the pressure. Jesus stood for his God. But more than that, he stood in our place sinners. And how did he do it? How did he conduct himself? Well, Isaiah summarizes it well in Isaiah 53 and verse 7, where he says, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He didn't lash out. He didn't retaliate. Courtesy. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearer is silent, so he opened not his mouth. What about Satan's plan? Satan's plan was surely that Jesus would abandon his post when it got the hottest. Satan's plan surely was that everything about the Lord God would disappear. It seemed like Satan's finest hour in history. Everything is about to disappear. Everything of God that is about to disappear. His name, His law, His covenant, His Son, His redemptive purpose, His people. But Satan failed. Satan was the one defeated, as Jesus was the one who accomplished God's. Jesus accomplished eternal redemption for sinners from every tribe and every nation and every tongue. Jesus stood for God's will and God's way. And He did it with heart conviction. Did it consistently. And He even did it courteously. Friends, if Jesus didn't stand on that day, there'd be no hope for the people of God. Actually, there'd be no people of God. Think of it. What Satan thought was his finest hour, in some ways, was his worst. And what appeared like the worst hour in Jesus' life, in a very real sense, was his finest. And he stood. He not only stood, he accomplished them. Let's spend a few moments in prayer.